Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the fascinating science behind how the human brain breaks down and, even more incredibly, how it brilliantly adapts. I am so excited to guide you through this material because we are going to look at some truly mind-bending mechanisms that are happening inside your head right this very second.
So what actually happens when the most complex machine in the universe gets pushed to its absolute limits? Or, breaks entirely? It's a pretty provocative thought, isn't it? We usually tend to think of our brains as these impenetrable fortresses of logic and memory. But the truth is, the brain is incredibly fragile, yet at the same time, astonishingly resilient. Today, we're going to ground ourselves in that mystery, exploring invisible injuries, devastating network disruptions, and the almost magical power of neuroplasticity.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the hidden brain crisis, brain networks in balance, the power of neuroplasticity, seeing through touch, and finally, adapting to new realities. Let's get right to it.
All right, Part 1, the hidden brain crisis.
Now, you might actually recognize the story of Dr. Bennett Omalu from the movie Concussion. For the longest time, the severe damage caused by repeated everyday hits in sports like football, well, it was completely hidden. Standard autopsies were totally missing it. Players were experiencing these terrible cognitive and behavioral declines, but it really wasn't until Dr. Omalu did a much deeper neurological workup that he found the culprit. He discovered this pathological buildup of something called tau protein right inside the brain matter. It's a perfect example of how massive, literally life-altering trauma can be completely invisible to traditional observation.
And get this, that invisibility, it applies to living patients too. Imagine someone suffers a concussion. They might have severe, terrifying symptoms, vomiting, slurred speech, maybe even facial paralysis, symptoms that honestly look exactly like a stroke. But if you put that same person in an MRI or CT scanner, the images often come back looking completely 100% normal. Why? Well, because the damage isn't structural on a large scale. What we're actually looking at is a microscopic cellular emergency. So what's really happening behind the scenes is this massive metabolic cascade. The physical trauma basically scrambles neural transmission, leading to huge spikes in ions like potassium and calcium. Suddenly, the cellular pumps that usually keep everything balanced have to work absolute overtime. But here's the catch. Blood flow often drops during this kind of trauma, meaning the mitochondria simply can't deliver enough energy, or ATP, to keep up. The result? A severe energy crisis right inside the neurons, and it's so incredibly tiny that no standard brain scan is ever going to pick it up.
Moving on to Part 2, brain networks and balance. Okay, to really grasp how global disruption works, we've got to understand the brain's networks. Think of the brain like a hybrid car. On one side, we have the default mode network. Researchers like David Ingvar and Randy Buckner discovered that when your brain is supposedly just idling, daydreaming, planning the future, remembering things, it is actually incredibly active in this specific network. Now contrast that with active attention. This is what you use for foveal task focus, using the sharp center of your vision and constantly scanning your environment. These two systems completely dictate how we interact with reality. But what happens if the network in charge of monitoring the outside world gets physically damaged?
Well, that brings us to a really devastating condition known as balance syndrome. It's essentially characterized by a severe, extreme form of tunnel vision. But here's the crazy part. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the patient's eyes. The breakdown is entirely within the brain's attention network. People with balance can literally only perceive a tiny, tiny fraction of the visual world at any given moment. They could be looking straight at your face and completely fail to notice someone walking up right next to you. The pathology behind this is just striking. The root cause of balance syndrome is typically bilateral lesions, meaning physical damage on both sides of the brain, stretching right across the precuneus and cuneus in the parietal lobe. And this very specific physical damage causes something called simultaneognosia. That's a big word, but it basically means the sheer inability to perceive multiple objects at the exact same time. These bilateral lesions quite literally trap the person in a tiny, localized bubble of awareness.
Which brings us to Section 3, the power of neuroplasticity.
It's pretty staggering to realize just how fragile our perception of reality really is, right? But let's shift gears to something a bit more empowering and look at how the brain actually fights back and compensates for these massive deficits. We used to think the brain was strictly siloed, like the visual cortex only handles sight, the somatosensory cortex only handles touch. But that's simply not true. Primary sensory cortices do not work in isolation. They are deeply interconnected, constantly influencing each other. And this crosstalk, it lays the vital groundwork for cross-modal plasticity.
It's this amazing mechanism where different senses can literally step up and substitute for one another if one system goes down.
Let's explore that in Section 4, Seeing Through Touch.
It is such a mind-bending reality. The user physically feels the shape of the image sort of bubbling on their tongue. But thanks to that cross-modal plasticity we just talked about, the brain eventually learns to interpret those tactile tingles as actual visual information. The user learns to literally see the object. It absolutely proves that the brain doesn't really care where the data comes from, it just wants the raw data so it can build a map of the world.
And finally, Section 5, Adapting to New Realities.
So, when clinicians are trying to treat spatial mapping issues, like what we see in Bálint syndrome or the severe spatial neglect that can happen after a brain injury, they use some incredibly clever therapies to force the brain to rewire itself. One of my favorites is prism adaptation. Here's how it works. A patient wears these special optical prism glasses that physically bend the incoming light, making everything look like it's shifted over to the right. So when they reach for an object, their hand misses to the right. This creates a massive mismatch between what their eyes are seeing and what their hand is actually doing. To fix this, the brain is forced to adapt, shifting its hand-eye coordination leftwards, right back toward that neglected side of space.
You can actually see the progression here. At first, with the prisms on, the patient completely misses the target, but by the end of the session, they are hitting it perfectly. And the craziest part? When they take the glasses off, they actually overcorrect to the left for a little while. That proves the brain physically altered its internal spatial map. Now, while this neuroplastic adaptation is incredible, we should note that without ongoing training, the benefits usually only last about 24 hours. So just to quickly recap everything we've covered in this explainer today, we've explored the hidden cellular emergencies of brain injuries, we broke down the devastating symptoms and pathology of Bálint syndrome, and we saw how treatments like prism training and sensory substitution prove our brains can literally rewire our reality.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Considering the vast, completely untapped potential of cross-modal plasticity we just looked at, how might your own brain rewire itself if it was pushed to its absolute limits? The human mind isn't just some static machine. It's a dynamic, ever-changing landscape of possibilities. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.